As since on title alone, I know some people may interpret this video as a kinda joke, I thought I would upload it on this day known for jokes. In saying that though, I approach this topic in all seriousness. Maybe not to the point of going out on my shield for it, but nonetheless something I view as truer than false. So without further ado, here's In Defense of 4Kids One Piece. To begin, the topic of censorship, and why, at least with One Piece, I don't view it as egregious as many others do. For starters, regardless of the 4Kids influence, the One Piece anime already toned down the events of the manga. For instance, during Marineford, an arc beyond the reach of the 4Kids treatment, the anime watered down the clash between Whitebeard and Akainu, where in the manga, the latter with a lava-infused punch melted off half of the former's face, while in the anime's rendition, that same blow merely singed off a chunk of its target's signature mustache. Or another time occurred in the as of today currently airing arc of Wano, where in a poverty-stricken village, a sobbing woman holding both a baby and a knife contemplated the idea that dying quickly to the blade may be better than facing prolonged starvation. Well, in the anime rendition of this manga panel, its adaptation completely removed the presence of the knife, which rendered this scene utterly pointless in the overall scheme of the story. I mentioned this moment in particular because one of the most criticized 4Kids edits involved dulling a regular knife into a toy one, so both versions censored a scene centering around a knife. Now yes, I acknowledge a target makes a difference in this comparison, but you cannot deny the parallel between them. And from that, I have to say, if you support the One Piece anime in general, mocking the 4Kids version comes off as a bit disingenuous, as even its untouched and unedited Japanese counterpart employed many of the same practices in censorship. Next, I have to say, I believe many people over-dramatize the alterations made by 4Kids. Putting it bluntly, I view those who criticize this adaptation as sticklers who perceive the series as something that it simply isn't. Like, if you listen to them, you'll leave with the impression that a series with graphic material akin to, say, Fist of the North Star or an 80s OVA received a complete overhaul that reduced it to a show for mere babies, when in reality, at its core, One Piece contains relatively tame content, which, even if not directly so, still appeals to a younger audience. Now yes, on occasions the series tackles more adult aspects, but even then, not to the extremes of other franchises within its own demographic. For example, compare the case of a young Big Mom unknowingly ingesting people she lived with, versus Dragon Ball Z's Cell, draining the life out of any person or thing he encountered. Now, even though One Piece implied Big Mom's eating of other people to the point of confirmation, the event itself still occurred off-screen, whereas DBZ's flat-out depicted Cell sucking the essence out of a man begging for mercy till he ended up as nothing more than a skin suit, which definitely seems more over the top than One Piece's example. Tying the messages of these 2 points together, I want to examine the differences of a specific scene between the manga, the untouched original anime, and the 4Kids rendition, regarding the time Lucky Roo shot first to defend his captain. Now, this event started off by featuring a bandit brandishing a firearm on Shanks, but before he could pull the trigger, an off-screen Lucky Roo in the same manner shot first. To begin, the manga's version of this sequence illustrated a stream of blood following the wound of the falling man. Next, the anime slightly altered this scene by positioning the point of contact to appear off to the side of the screen, away from the focal point, while also removing any traces of blood. Finally, the 4Kids treatment basically replayed this moment and concluded it with an additional line of dialogue from Shanks that went along the lines of, "When he wakes up, tell him it was just a blank." On to why, in this scenario, I defend 4Kids and their edits. For starters, the anime itself already toned down this event from what it portrayed in the manga, so if you criticize 4Kids, then you also have to criticize the anime itself. Secondly, the subject of Shanks' extra line, which even though it lightens the mood, it does present itself in a cool way, as it expands upon the portrayal of him secretly manipulating the situation the entire time, by making it seem like his opponents even require his permission to die. Thirdly, I actually view this as meshing well with the scene itself. Like, since the man he referenced remained intact, i.e. not bleeding profusely, much less something like head visibly blown apart, the dialogue didn't necessarily contradict the on-screen image, and without prior knowledge of this censorship, could be easily perceived as what actually transpired. Going off on a bit of a tangent, I actually think this addition integrates fine into the nature of Shanks as a character, as frequently many of his scenes feature radical shifts of tone. Like at a later point of the story, when approached by Mihawk, he menacingly remarked, "Now I can't let you leave." Then afterwards, in stark contrast to what was said, you see them merrily drinking together, meaning the situation led you to believe this encounter would end violently, only for it to go the opposite route. So, presenting a scenario where you think Shanks had a character killed only to reveal them as living doesn't go against the grain of his established personality. On that note, One Piece itself possesses an infamy for not killing off characters, especially in the sense of misleading the audience into thinking they may have. For instance, in Alabasta, the character Pell somehow survived a country-leveling nuclear blast. So again, the censorship applied by 4Kids isn't all that uncommon in the canonical story, which is why I don't view it as all that destructive in the long run. While still on this topic, I want to say I don't think the 4Kids alterations are as clear-cut or as noticeable as many make them out to be. Like, I just referred to how the character Pell lives through a nuclear blast. Well, when I learned that 4Kids apparently heavily watered down One Piece, I just assumed that as a form of toning down the series, they added an extra scene of Pell walking post-explosion to create the censored illusion that he made it out alive when he hadn't. But much to my surprise, I found out that that actually happened in the real story. And me thinking something was censorship when it actually classified as canon was not a one-off occurrence either. Like, another occasion involved the cyborg Frankie and his fuel. First off, let me state that I know he appeared long after the 4Kids run, but I just thought the broadcasters of the Funimation release forced this aspect into the televised version, and not that it actually occurred in the canonical story. Now, as a source of energy, Frankie drinks cola to power himself up, and many times after its consumption, he acts a little intoxicated. And because of that, I had assumed they replaced alcohol in favor of cola to serve as his primary fuel, which again turned out wrong, as in the main story, cola indeed powered him up. With that out of the way, I have to say, many of the 4Kids changes seem well within the realm of possibility, and not too out of place for One Piece. Let me put it like this, the 4Kids localization turned a firearm into a trigger-based hammer, which obviously comes off as silly and more complicated than necessary, but that works into the established humor of One Piece. Again, I return to Frankie, who possesses a centaur form, where the front of his leg split off into new ones, which looks like it would actually hinder his movement / him as a fighter. So because these two aspects seem similar, supports why I say many of these alterations sync up with the style of One Piece. Switching gears, a time I actually prefer a change made by 4Kids to the original story, pertaining to the tragic fate of Kuina, the female rival to a young Zoro, or Zolo in regards to 4Kids. Now, despite her physical limitations, she possessed an innate talent for the sword, allowing her to best stronger and older foes. And because of that, in their youth, Zoro never managed to beat her. Here's where the differences begin. In the 4Kids rendition, an older boy she previously beat, in retaliation with several friends, ambushed her and beat her to the point where she could no longer wield a sword anymore. While in the original story, she randomly fell down a flight of stairs and died. On to why I prefer the technically censored version. To start off, even though 4Kids remove death from the equation, their retelling in essence comes off as more brutal or adult than simply falling down the stairs, as since she lived but can't use a sword implies she really took a severe beating, which adds a harsh dose of reality to it, plus an easy to get behind unfairness. While falling down the stairs borderline comes off as comical, as since its revelation introduces itself in an abrupt randomness, while also adding a goofy "that's all it took to bring her down" element. Also, the 4Kids variant retains any positives from the original version. Like, even though Kuina lived, Zoro can't fairly avenge his loss, meaning the removal of death didn't really affect his character arc. So, because in my opinion 4Kids improved the narrative from the story, stands as a reason for why I defend this adaptation. Next up, a change I view as weak in the 4Kids repertoire, but still perceive as far better than many other localizations, which involves the altering of how Luffy landed a blow on the man made of sand, Crocodile. In its original form, Luffy doused his hand in his own blood, so he could solidify his opponent's malleable body, while in the 4Kids version, he instead resorted to just his own sweat. For starters, I argue this is a weakness for the adaptation, because water previously failed against Crocodile, and as a substance, sweat isn't too drastically different than that. So in the context of the story, this strategy should not have worked. In saying that though, when comparing similar instances from other anime with blood-related censorships, I don't view this case as all that terrible. Like, changing blood to sweat semi-conforms to human biology, so at least a little room for believability still exists. Whereas with what I consider a weaker example, often trended in 2000s anime censorship, involving recoloring red blood into a green liquid, which has no rationale behind it. Two such cases include the Deke release of Saint Seiya, or Tokyo Pop's Rave Master. In mentioning this too, bear with me for a bit on this one, but in this One Piece scene, blood occupied a relatively minimal presence overall, so its recoloring carried little effect. Like if a localization tried to convince you that a chopped in half character oozed sweat, not blood, I'd call that bad censorship, as you can't even pretend to turn a blind eye to something that obvious. But for One Piece, in this fight, the role of blood wasn't as emphasized. Like the scene began with Luffy, much to the surprise of Crocodile, landing a blow, provoking the latter to wonder why it happened, only for him to notice blood smeared on his opponent's hand, leading him to connect the dots and figure out that blood serves as a catalyst. So, at least with this change, a chance it may go unrealized exists. Now, if Luffy intentionally injured himself, or the visual specifically focused on him drenching his hand in blood, I wouldn't be as forgiving with this censorship/cover-up. But since it presented this moment more as an out-of-nowhere surprise, I'm more tolerant towards this alteration, as it doesn't noticeably clash with the occurring sequence. To sum up my views on how 4Kids toned down One Piece, I honestly don't see it as all that big a deal. To be perfectly clear, I'm no fan of censorship, but at the same time, I won't pretend as if all cases are equal. Like omitting deaths from One Piece would be nowhere near as devastating as it would be with Fist of the North Star. And I even view this idea as true within 4Kids' own localization of the series. Like, I don't mind Sanji smoking a lollipop, as that seems like something that would exist within the greater story, or could exist in his preset character, whereas removing Smoker's cigar diminishes much of his personality, as cigars subtly suggest authoritativeness, thus omitting it lessens that element of him. So yeah, I admit, this version has its own ups and downs. In saying that though, I've seen watered-down renditions perform much worse than 4Kids One Piece. Like Rave Master tried to play off characters at a casino with gambling equipment clearly visible, as at the arcade, so it didn't even attempt to match what was stated, and for that reason, is why I'm more fond of the 4Kids localization, since it came with coherency. All in all, I believe what makes One Piece, its spirit, remained intact in this localization. On to the next subject. Now, one of the most uttered criticisms of the One Piece anime involved how it often stretched out many scenes longer than necessary, which has led many fans wishing for a reboot in the style of Hunter x Hunter 2011, or at the very least a One Piece Kai. Now, for those requesting such an adaptation, 4Kids basically provided just that, as its interpretation shortened overly elongated scenes, cut several filler episodes, and even removed canon material that at the time went nowhere. Building off of that, many took issue with this practice, as some of those omissions later assumed a greater role in the future of the story, such as with Laboon the Whale, or the giants Bragi and Dory. Admittedly, their removals create some late-game issues, but they are as far from unsolvable. For instance, as the One Piece anime has aired for so long, often when the cast reunited with an old character, or someone tangential to a past event, the series usually provided an accompanying flashback to remind the older fans of what previously transpired, or more importantly, serve as an info dump for new viewers. So the 4Kids version could just use those sequences to establish background information. Admittedly, introducing a supposedly already known character and saying they have a history with the protagonist via flashback can appear as awkward storytelling, but it isn't totally immersion-breaking. Like, even the 2011 reboot of Hunter x Hunter that everyone loves went down that path too, through the character of Kite, meaning it could work for One Piece too. While still on this topic, since 4Kids already expressed a willingness to alter elements of the story to fit their own view, that means they could still tweak future events to make them consistent with their original edits. So in the end, I don't think the omissions of these later important aspects would amount to all that massive an issue either. Up next will be likely the most controversial opinion of this video, pertaining to why I enjoyed the 4Kids dub, and how on several occasions, in terms of voiceover work, I think it stands as the best version. But first off, I have to air a grievance against the modern scene of anime voice acting, specifically against the English language dubs. Now, even though the current era has at its disposal superior recording equipment, a wider talent pool, and to a certain extent, I'd even say the voice actors themselves possess better acting skills than those of the previous generation, I still view older dubs as superior. Because the modern industry places a greater emphasis on the recording aspects instead of the actual roles themselves, i.e. personalizing them, which in my opinion has led to newer dubs feeling a bit cookie-cutter-ish, as many voice actors now resort to just using their normal voice instead of making it sound more distinct. What exacerbates this issue all the more regards the increased amount of English language dubs put out a year, which makes the repeated use of the same voice actors all the more apparent. For instance, with the Funimation dub, many of their casting choices for the Straw Hats flat out sync up with the Z-Fighters from Dragon Ball Z Kai. Luffy, Kid Gohan, Zoro, Piccolo, Usopp, Krillin, Sanji, Future Trunks, which for me has made this rendition of One Piece seem more like an extension of Kai rather than its own independent thing. Now let me say, the series later has mostly broken away from this trend with the newer members, But still, the ones who parallel the cast of Dragon Ball Z Kai usually occupy more screen time than those who deviated. On that note, I realize this issue may not affect everyone else as it did me, especially if they may not be as familiar with all that many anime series. But that reason alone elevates my perception of the 4Kids version. Let me put it like this. Everyone likes to poke fun at how they randomly gave Sanji a Brooklyn accent. But if you hear it, you'll know it's 4Kids Sanji. Whereas if you hear his Funimation voice, unless he mentions something specific, you may not pick up on if it's him or another character, such as future Trunks, Loki from Fairy Tail, or Kimberly from Fullmetal Alchemist. So even if you argue that Funimation's audio sounds better, or that its casting debatably performs at a higher level, I still lean in favor of 4Kids. Or at least with the Straw Hat Pirates I do, because they possess less recognizable voices that also carry themselves with more of a distinct identity. And that line serves as a great bridge to why I believe the 4Kids version of Chopper even beats out the original Japanese interpretation of him. As a character, Chopper wields many forms, but with that said, I'm only focusing on two of them, in particular his main variant, the hybrid form, which basically resembles a small bipedal stuffed animal, and his humanoid transformation, which appears as a hulking muscular man. Across the 3 dubs I've referenced, Chopper's hybrid form received a high-pitched squeaky voice, but in his humanoid state, these renditions diverge. Whereas in the Japanese and Funimation versions, he retained the same childlike voice, whereas his in the 4Kids version assumed a much more gruff, deeper one. In terms of the English language, I realize some will automatically claim that the Funimation version wins, because it's more authentic since it follows the source material. But to me, the 4Kids rendition easily stomps out the other two, as it undeniably adds a creative new element into the fray, while also personalizing it, and induces a more immersive feeling. Like if a body transforms, the voice changing alongside it doesn't seem out of the ordinary. So in this scenario, I say the 4Kids alteration beats out the original version, or what's considered canon. With that said, now would be a good time to address another complaint about the 4Kids dub, regarding how they gave many characters higher weird-sounding voices, while also constantly resorting to accents. To start off, I defend its use here, because the franchise already exhibits wacky characters with goofy voices. Like the arc of Dressrosa featured Pika, a very masculine, tough-looking guy who, jokingly enough, harbors a high nasally-sounding voice. In addition to that, on a macro scale, most members of the cast possess a distinct laugh. Like instead of a normal ha ha ha, a character such as Big Mom has one that goes mama mama mama. By the way, the manga's text even includes these laughs too. So since the story itself already features out their vocal idiosyncrasies, stands as why I say many of the oddities of the 4Kids dub meshes well with the series. Now, with the accents, I'll admit they don't always land, but in general, I think they work, or at least the idea behind them does. For instance, I prefer Funimation's voice for Shanks, but with 4Kids giving him a British accent, even though I think they could have found a more suitable sounding one, I still like the idea of its inclusion, as it adds to the immersion of his identity, that as a character, he originates from a far-off land, from where the series' starting point began. So even if the voice itself may not be ideal, it has a good idea behind it. Besides all that, at its core, One Piece revolves around adventure, encountering diverse peoples, and visiting foreign lands, meaning having some exotic-sounding voices promotes the nature of all those aspects. Similarly, the author of the story, Eiichiro Oda, said if the Straw Hat Pirates came from the real world, they would all reflect different cultures. So Sanji having a Brooklyn accent and Robin sounding like a Southern belle creates the illusion that they all stem from different lands. In the words of the author himself, he did say Sanji represents France and not New York, which he finally revealed in 2009, after 4Kids canceled their dub of One Piece. But regardless, Sanji's accent vocally supplements the idea that the Straw Hat Pirates comprise of people from different cultures. Next, I praised the 4Kids dub for a reason that may be perceived as a little unfair, which is that as its run ended prematurely, it dodged several issues that typically plague long-running series. For instance, I believe Funimation chose the perfect voice for the role of Blackbeard. But here's the thing, that person died long before the completion of the series, so Funimation had to replace them in future episodes, meaning you as a viewer have to turn the blind eye to this different sounding voice. For the record, this issue also occurred in the Japanese dub as well, but for them I want to focus on a different aspect, which is that many of their voice actors have been performing these roles for decades at this point. And let's just say it's become more apparent in their characters lately. For reference, the story portrays Nami as this young, attractive beauty, but in all honesty, her voice actress comes off as a bit too old for this role. Like as a character, she sounds 20 years older than someone who in story is 10 years older than Nami. So again, the anime continuing on for so long allowed for some issues voice-wise to arise. In summation, even though the 4Kids dub made some questionable decisions regarding its casting choices, they usually maintained the spirit of the series, and incorporated some creative and immersive elements that add an extra layer of substance to the experience. And on that note, I'll say some of their decisions may have been crazy, but they're just crazy enough to work. To conclude this video, I have to say I think many people intentionally look for reasons to hate the 4Kids localization, instead of just trying to enjoy it and appreciate it for what it is. Primarily because I believe many people view it as responsible for One Piece's initial lack of success in the West, when in reality they weren't at fault, and at the time, it more so stemmed from the fact that the series itself didn't fit into the established anime fan bases. Like, it lacked the sleek coolness of, say, Cowboy Bebop, nor did it aim to be a gritty power fantasy like Dragon Ball Z or Yu Yu Hakusho, and it definitely swerved away from the addictive gotta-catch-em-all aspects of Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh! So because it didn't check certain boxes, I think it struggled to find its particular niche audience. Secondly, I'm not the type of person to say that just because something had effort behind it automatically means it deserves credit. But I think people ignore the fact that 4Kids definitely had One Piece's best interest in mind, and that they worked hard to make the series successful. Whereas I've seen many of their dubs or localizations where you can obviously tell their licensors viewed as nothing more than a slot filler. Like, even though 4Kids edited One Piece, they at least tried to make it coherent, whereas many others never even attempted to make the dialogue match the occurring scene. So 4Kids does deserve some respect there. Plus, I have to say, I believe there's a certain memeable charm about this version and their edits. Even the Funimation dub through the imposter Straw Hats poked fun at 4Kids Sanji's accent. And because of that, I think more people would appreciate this rendition if they viewed it as its own independent version, rather than as purely a One Piece adaptation. Finally, I have to say, without a doubt, 4Kids One Piece has issues and imperfections that not even I could defend or forgive. But in saying that, nothing is perfect. Not the uncut and unedited anime, nor even its manga that I consider vastly superior to both versions. So, I just view the 4Kids version as a well-intended but unsuccessful localization that receives a little too much hate. And that's why I stand in defense of 4Kids One Piece. Thanks for watching this video, hopefully you all enjoyed it. If you want to hear me talk more about One Piece, you may consider watching my 2 videos breaking down why I think the Whole Cake Island arc did everything better than Dragon Ball Super's Universal Survival arc. Or, if you want to hear me talk more about a 4Kids localization, consider giving my Ultimate Muscle video a view. Again, thanks for watching.